Hey guys, my name is Jordan Koss. Welcome to the Almost Essential podcast. This 16-episode series is based off my final project for my Doctorate of Ministry degree at Fuller Theological Seminary. The title of that final project is Almost Essential Evangelists, Improving Retirement Asset Accumulation for Mainstream Church of Christ Pastors. In this series, we will interview 8 different specialists in 8 separate episodes. And we will also interview 2 pastors from each of 8 different regions around the U.S. This final project was inspired by 10 years of ministry in 3 different churches of Christ from Georgia to Northern California from 2010 to 2019, as well as my time as a financial professional in training in 2020. That is where I learned about the retirement crisis America is in and will be experiencing in the coming years. Now, I have 3 goals for this podcast. 1, provide an accessible, denomination-specific qualitative conversation for Church of Christ pastors and leaders. 2, introduce leaders and listeners to retirement vehicles and strategies they may not have heard about before. And 3, provide encouragement, motivation, and knowledge to save for the last third of life. Thank you for listening and enjoy. All right, guys, welcome to the Almost Essential podcast. This is the episode where we will start interviewing some pastors from around the country. This just so happens to be the Mountain West episode, where we're going to be interviewing 2 different pastors from the Mountain West region of America. We have my co-host with me again, Lars Coburn. Lars, say a quick hey. He is in.
Oh, there we go. I am in a coffee shop. Yeah, there we go. So I was saying hey, and my mute button was on. But yeah, so I serve as Director of University Relations, doing church relations up in Eugene, Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest. Jordan and I met actually on a church relations excursion at a Pepperdine event. And so church relations is something that I care a lot about, and this project really fits into kind of thinking about the whole person. Soul care of a pastor is not just what they're useful for right now, but thinking about their whole life and how they can be part of the kingdom even after their quote-unquote useful time in the pulpit or in their ministry ends. So I'm interested in caring for pastors in that way, as I've been cared for by others before me. So thanks, Jordan, for including me, and I'm looking forward to getting to know our guests.
All right, thanks, Lars. And our 2 guests today, the first one is Glen Bowman. Glen, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell our listeners and viewers about you.
So my name's Glen Bowman. I was converted as a 23-year-old, spent a few years just growing in Christ and decided I wanted to do full-time ministry. So I went to Harvard Graduate School, had this cool roommate named Jordan Koss, and enjoyed my time for the most part there. I mean, I enjoy watching sports, all that stuff. I kind of miss it sometimes. But anyway, I've been blessed to be at full-time ministry in Mississippi for a few years, California for 6 years, and about a year for the Mountain West region. And so New Mexico, it's a different place, but, God is good everywhere. And so I've just enjoyed all the experiences I've had and getting to talk about something meaningful today.
Yeah, and I just learned that you're no longer with that church in New Mexico, which is cool, interesting. But tell us where you are at now and what your plans are.
So I'm near Como, where I used to preach in Mississippi, and I'm here in a house with my wife and 2 kids, and I preach just over half the Sundays, filling in different places, and work at a library part-time. But I plan to start, if it's God's will, at a campus ministry in Mississippi in the summer, and really get it going in the fall. So I'm looking forward to that, because I have a heart to reach out to young people, and there's plenty there.
Yeah, so you've been all over the place, Glenn, different regions, different vocations. Like you taught at York University, correct, in Nebraska for a couple years. Is that right?
Yeah, it was just 1 year, but yeah, I taught psychology there, and I enjoyed it for the most part. It was neat, being able to connect with the students at that type of level, and just to have students of all walks of life, and to be able to be like a normal person, not seen as a preacher. I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that is kind of cool. And then our second guest is Dustin Rocha. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. Dustin, go ahead, introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
My name's Dustin Rocha. Close. Um, I'm actually in Worland, Wyoming, kind of the northern part of Wyoming. I was baptized in my teenage years. I grew up in California, Los Banos. That's where I met Glen.
Okay.
Later on in life, Glen was actually the preacher there. That's kind of how we met. I felt called to the ministry, decided I wanted to be a preacher. I went to Bear Valley Bible Institute in Denver. From there, I started my full-time ministry in Nebraska, Sidney, Nebraska, the western part. Worked there for 6 years as the full-time preacher there, kind of a stateside mission work, a very small congregation there. And then after there, I ended up here in Wyoming. And so I've been here for 4 years.
Okay. And you said
what?
Yeah, that's great. I'm very thankful that you could be a part of this as well. And you said your church and your town that you're currently living in is right at the base of the Bighorn Mountains?
Yes. Yeah,
awesome.
We're kind of in the Bighorn Basin is what they call it.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, we're right at the base of the Bighorn Mountains.
So that is quite the unique context to do ministry in Churches of Christ. That's pretty cool. And then Glen, where you were at in New Mexico, was in the eastern New Mexico in the high plains. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, really flat. I kind of wish I could be near mountains like Dustin, but it's all good when I think about it could be colder in the mountains too.
Yeah. So in terms of like Churches of Christ overall, when you get outside of the Bible Belt, the South and Texas, you're kind of like on the fringe of what it feels like. You feel so distant from everybody else. And so I'm interested to get your perspective as ministers in the Mountain West in general, but also your perspective on accumulating assets for retirement, which is what this podcast is all about, to try to help Church of Christ pastors improve their asset accumulation for retirement within the context of America's DIY retirement crisis. And so let's go ahead and get to the first question in that light. And the first question was related to, I asked you to read a portion of what I've written so far for my final project on the demographics of Churches of Christ, and also a section on the 30-plus year decline of Churches of Christ since 1990. And so the first question is, what stood out to you? Let me mention a few things that stood out to me, and I want to get your thoughts in terms of what stood out to you. What I found is like what I just mentioned. There's been a 30-plus year decline in Churches of Christ. Their zenith appears to have been 1990, where we've reached the peak number of membership attendance. And since then, we have these projections for the next 30 years, recent projections from around, 2020 is when a couple articles that I cite in my paper, but their projections are pretty dire. By 2050, the denomination is expected to be around 250,000 membership, down from over 1 million. And then 2,800 congregations remaining in 2050, down by thousands of what currently is today. So those are some dire predictions based upon a number of factors. One of the things I believe that Stan Granberg mentioned in his article about Church of Christ demographics was that 55% of congregations back in 2016 had just an average attendance of 34 people. So imagine what that is just now, 7 years removed from 2016. And another thought that just kind of struck me as I was looking at all these demographics was like in 1906, that's when Church of Christ broke off from Disciples of Christ. I had no understanding of the history of Church of Christ, even when I first went to become a study Bible in college. But 1906 was that moment that divide was official, right? And it seems like Church of Christ are experiencing another 1906 moment, but this time, instead of as a result of division, it's a result of attrition. We're losing people not only to death, but also we can't hold on to our kids because we've created these church systems and ecclesiology that is geared towards the older members and just pushing younger members away and outside of the Church of Christ system and ecclesiology. And the West Coast, and one of the interim ministry partners' articles based upon their work with like over 50 churches around the country from various sizes, they said the West Coast is actually the canary in the coal mine for these problems for the Bible Belt. The West Coast Churches of Christ are kind of the warning canary for the churches that perhaps may feel a little bit safer in Texas and Tennessee, if you will. And then a couple of the reasons that we found that Church of Christ are shrinking in terms of their demographics, etc., is like the loss of exclusivism, the loss due to death of the older generations. Again, and that's not being offset because the kids of those older generations aren't staying, so they're not reversing that death rate with birth rate, nor with bringing new people to faith and evangelism, nor are we planting churches. There was an interesting statistic that said only 2,938 churches were planted from 1948 to 1990, which was just a third of the 10,089 church base from 1948. That's just insane. We just haven't been planting churches whatsoever at the rate that we need to survive as a denomination. And then finally, one of the things that the Interim Ministry Partner article says in terms of their 5 factors for the decline, which is I found to be significant, is that the church polity, the ecclesiology, and specifically exclusive elder leadership, that plays a role in not being able to turn things around in terms of the decline of the denomination. There's more. I want to mention one more thing, but I want to get your input into what you read and thought was significant from those 2 sections. So, Glenn, let's start with you. What did you find most significant there?
Well, so I took Dr. Gamberg a few of his classes, and so something, because he brought this general idea that this isn't just Church of Christ, this is almost everybody. You know what I'm saying? They're losing lots of members. So I think part of it is the cultural shift, you know, that we're experiencing. So to be honest, there wasn't a lot that blew my mind, although the numbers, like you're saying, are very sobering. You know, I was aware of the trend. I guess only recently, how we've talked about, I've switched a lot the last couple of years in what I've been doing, because sometimes, like, if you have an elder who is, you know, not just shepherding, you know, like generally speaking, but who is like controlling, you know, that can hinder the growth or the even maintaining the same numbers in a church, you know. So obviously there are lots of factors, you know, in general, you know, kids are more concerned about YouTube than Jesus, a lot of them, you know, which is really sad, but you could argue it's the way people have done youth ministry or not done youth ministry. You know, there's so many angles that you can go, but it's sad. And of course, there's, in my opinion, need for evangelism toward especially younger people, but just anyone in general. You know, I think the church is not as evangelistic as it was like in the 40s and 50s. You know, there's a reason the church grew so much, you know, and so I think it's honestly a call back to Jesus would be like the greatest need, you know, which is why I think these are happening, because everyone thinks the preacher's got to do it, man. The preacher, that's his job, to save souls. The preacher's going to build back the church, you know, instead of like, this is all of us in Christ, like working together.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Dustin, what stood out to you the most from those 2 sections you read?
You know, I don't think anything was alarming to me. I think when you're in the trenches and you see this, you know, you especially, you know, I've traveled a lot to different churches, especially in different areas. You know, you see these numbers. You know, you see the declines, and it's not everywhere, because you see different churches, you see different congregations, and like Glenn said, it's across the board. It's not just Churches of Christ, but you know, you see this, you know, everywhere, and I don't think you know, we can make a blanket statement and say it's all the Churches of Christ,
right?
Because there are certain ones that are doing a very good job, and it's you know, you visit, it's not just older people, it's younger people, and you're seeing a very good turnover. You know, that they are retaining their younger people, and so I think it goes back to the people. You know, what are they not doing successfully? You know, and it goes back to the culture. You know, a lot of times we see that pendulum swing. You know, it goes from, you know, they're you know, very conservative. They're really leaning into God in the culture, and then it kind of swings the other way, and everyone's leaning away from God, and you know, and the church suffers through that, and then it starts to go the other way. You know, but we're kind of in a part of our culture where, you know, the children of the people who were really hardcore into God, they've kind of pushed away, and those people, we have all these older people within the church, like they were hardcore into God, and we see that in those statistics.
Mm-hmm.
But what they seem to have failed to do was instill that into their kids. Okay. And so we have all these churches, and at least from my experience, a lot of the smaller churches. Mm-hmm. It's a lot of these smaller churches that are just shrinking, and they're 30-something people, and you go and look at their families, and none of them are going to church.
Yeah.
Or they might, some might go to this church or that church, but most of the time they don't go to church because they failed to instill in their kids, into their family, mm-hmm. God. Yeah. And so it's just trying to bring it back, teach the kids, instill God into the kids.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. One of the things that I think was interesting, as I kind of have now gotten to know two sides of our movement, the Disciples of Christ, highly connectional, but experiencing the same kinds of decline. Independent Christian churches, not as connectional, a little bit more like us in that way, but maybe holding on a little bit more. And I'd be curious for you guys in your region, specifically in the Mountain West. I know, Glen, you've got all these different experiences, but in your time there in the Mountain West, New Mexico, and then up through Wyoming and all that, what connections have brought some of the churches of Christ together? Are there camps that you guys do together? Are there gatherings, Fifth Sunday singings? All those kind of things. Because I know, as we reach back, there's often kind of a history there. Like, we used to do this and that, and there used to be these rallies that would bring us together. So I'm curious, in your experience, maybe pre-pandemic, were those things still happening? I know the pandemic interrupted and disrupted a lot of those differently, maybe accelerated the decline of some of them. But are those still happening for you guys in the Mountain West? Or do you go to other regions? Like, do some of your churches go to Texas, or some of your churches go to the West Coast? Are there things specific to kind of your region that gather you together?
So where I was, I got there during COVID, and I left when things were like more opened up. And because of the sparseness of population, I think in the Mountain West, it's a little bit different. Because in California, you can go an hour or two and you just got all these options, all these churches, whereas you didn't really have that much, and honestly, a Church of Christ were stronger than I would have expected, because it was maybe the very fringe of the Bible Belt near Texas. And I think that, youth rallies, because I did youth ministry, toward the tail end when things had opened up, and, the kids really seemed to enjoy that. And we had a church van and went like a few hours, and we started to go back to camp and get excited about camp and sponsor camp. And so these things that were also big in California, I felt like the Mountain West was a little bit more similar than that. It's just not quite as much engagement. I felt like the churches didn't do as much with other churches in my region of the Mountain West as they did in California. But we did have an area-wide singing, and we did have one. And there was even people outside of Church of Christ that came, which I'm not used to that from California. It's usually like just COC, And so that was kind of cool, when they're like, oh, that's so-and-so from the Baptist church or whatever. It's like, oh, okay, cool. And he led a song, and it was a cappella, and, So, yeah, it had its bright moments, but I don't know what it really looked like, even just 5 years ago.
Yeah. Dustin, how would you respond to Lars's question?
So I have two different experiences. When I was in Sidney, Nebraska, because the western part of Nebraska is so rural, the churches really did hardly anything with anyone, because you were driving 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours to get to the next church. Really, we didn't have hardly any contact with other churches. I reached out, I would get to know the other ministers, but other than that, the members really didn't know the other members of the other churches. And so we really didn't do anything with any of the other churches. When I moved to Wyoming, it was a whole different story. We have Bible camps, we have youth rallies. There's something always going on. When the pandemic hit, we did stop the Bible camp for 1 year just because it was just too many hoops to jump through. But Wyoming is kind of like the rebellious state. There were hardly any restrictions. Our congregation actually did put on a mini Bible camp, or for our youth, and all the youth got to invite a friend. But I mean, we really didn't slow down. There's a Bible camp going on, or youth rally going on every couple months. We have within our kind of basin, all the church, Church of Christ around. We call the basin area wide youth group, and so we do something almost every month. Whether it's winter or summer, it doesn't matter. And we're constantly doing stuff for the youth, for the members, and even if it is with the youth, we involve the adults to show the youth that it's not just you. You don't have to do your stuff and it's separate from the adults. You do your stuff with the adults because you're part of the adults. You're part of the congregation. Yeah, and so it's a whole different. Even though you drive, like we just did a youth rally in Cheyenne. We drove 6 hours to get there. Mm-hmm. It was like a 3-day youth rally. And so that's just how it is. And everyone drives, and we just whole different mentality, and it's just constantly going on. And so even though we're separated and our congregation governs itself and we do it, we're all involved. Mm-hmm. We're all brothers and sisters. And so it's just a whole different mentality.
Very cool. Now, you did mention and I want to take note of that it's not, you're right, it's not just Churches of Christ that are experiencing this sort of decline over the past 30 plus years. And this is kind of like a across the board white dominant denominations in America are experiencing the same decline simply because America is becoming more diverse. Again, Americans are having fewer kids, older generations are dying off. There's a lot of different factors, but Church of Christ are not alone in that decline. I also wanted to mention one more thing that kind of stuck out to me that I was able to find another Fuller Seminary D-Min project by a guy back in 2002 by the name of Andrew Wall. He wrote about the disaffiliation of Church of Christ members in Southern California. I'm in Northern California. I'm in the Bay Area, so I found that his findings were very interesting. And Southern California itself, if you read the history books, in terms of how did Churches of Christ become so big in SoCal, Dust Bowl, they kind of planted the Bible Belt kind of COC culture in California moving west. So the Central Valley feels very similar to what you possibly would find in the southern United States, which was interesting for me and surprised to me when I served at a church in Modesto and also in the South Bay. But what Andrew Wall found is that Church of Christ members in Southern California disaffiliated from Church of Christ and went to other churches in different denominations, ultimately due to sociological incongruity, which is very similar to the reasons behind the division in 1906. There was so much difference in just the people that made up the movement that sociological incongruity led to division in 1906, and it's leading to a similar one today. Basically, he says members who have left are more educated, wealthy, and upwardly mobile, and they're looking for churches with similar people. What are your thoughts on that?
It's far ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go for it.
I was going to say, I feel like that does sound like the 1906 thing. I'm not as familiar with that. Mm-hmm. I'm more familiar, I think, the way that Dustin described, where there's a very conservative versus progressive, and there's kind of you would argue maybe the average progressive person is more wealthy and has these different characteristics. I think, there's been, probably too far in extremes of Church of Christ, the only people going to heaven, and it doesn't matter what you believe about the Bible. There is a happy medium somewhere, that ought to be met and that hasn't been met. And so I think I heard someone say one time that the average atheist in the 1960s knew more Bible than the average Christian, loosely categorized today. And, I have all kind of conversation about the Bible with people, and I might believe that because, there's not that much understanding, and of course, if we're just, because I thought, when I first was looking to find a church, you just church shop, it don't really matter, and so Southern California is a lot different culturally than Northern California. And I do think, there is something like Wyoming, like how, if there's not a ton of you there in Church of Christ, you feel like more of a kinship, but if there's a bunch of you and a bunch of churches, and, it's kind of like Memphis area, you just kind of pick your favorite flavor of church that day, and you just do it, whereas like, it's a little bit more, I think, loyalty to like, this congregation where you grew up, even like Central Valley. I felt like that was a little stronger. I felt like there was a little bit more consumerism in the Bay Area, was like, oh, I didn't like the preacher saying this, I'm going over here or whatever. So it definitely changed your mentality if that's the way you think, as opposed to this where's my mama was and my grandmama was, and this is where I'm going to die,
Mm-hmm. Okay. Dustin, what are your thoughts on that, especially in light of where you're at now in ministry?
I don't face those issues here.
Okay.
We don't typically see, like that reason of why people are, leave. Okay. And so I can see that. I've been to a few churches in Southern California, so I can kind of see that. Mm-hmm. At the same time, my thoughts are, kind of going back to a little bit of what Glen said, is like, we sometimes or a lot of times we search for churches based on what we want, mm-hmm. not based on what God wants.
Okay.
And we see, and that's universal. No matter where we go, we see people that, church shop. It's just the consumeristic idea. And they come in and it's like, we want a church that fits me. Mm-hmm. I want a church that I can go and be comfortable. Whereas when we look at church, it's not my church, it's God's church. Mm-hmm. It's, we come to worship. It's not about what I get out of worship. It's about what I'm supposed to give to God when I worship.
Right.
And we lose that idea. Mm-hmm. And I think over time we've lost that idea. Yeah. Because we think we think worship's about me. And I think over time we've lost that, and as a people we've made it about me. And so it's like, well, I'm going to go to this church, and if I don't like the people there, if I don't like what the church is offering, well, I'm just going to go find a church that fits me. And it doesn't matter if it's pleasing to God, and so we and that's why we see all these different churches, because we keep changing to find, as culture changes, to find what's pleasing to the people, what's going to attract the most people versus, well, what's pleasing to God, because that's who we're pleasing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's, one of the things that, and I know Andy Wall actually worked with several of the people at his church and got to know him over time. And, I think one of the things that he was, really keen in on is that lack of exclusivism that mm-hmm. came out in the research, right? Okay. That as people are more educated and more fluent, they then also kind of have that upward mobility of like being able to have choice. And I think sometimes, at least as I visited with my grandmother and even with my parents, as they've kind of gone that journey, they would describe it as that. There was a sense of certainty that we were going to the right church. There was a sense of this is the place we're supposed to be, and that we're doing that to honor God. And as for right or wrong, I'm not making a judgment call here, for right or wrong, as people have gone on this journey, and I would say as America has gone on this journey, certainty has come into question. And as that certainty comes into question, we can offer a couple of different visions. And I think one of the things I see happening in many ways in our movement is an opportunity to learn from the disciples of Christ, not necessarily to follow them and mimic them, but to learn from their experience, because their bell curve is basically us 20 years or 30 years from now. We can go back in the history, and they were going through a very similar numerical decline as we are reaching now about 30 years ago, and congregational decline. And then we can look at the independents, and many of the large mega churches that are non-denominational now actually have their roots in our heritage in the independent Christian church. And many times they are doubling down on the idea of this is the right kind of church. This is how we honor God. More not in a direct exclusivist message, but very, very similar. And so I wonder for us if we get to kind of pay attention while we walk, in some ways, the middle road from both sides, not doubling down necessarily on the old view, but also not kind of not going ahead with culture and just and just going swimming with the stream, if you will. But saying, yeah, we are going to be a little bit weird. We are going to be a little bit focused on restoring the ancient church, and that might call us to a different kind of discipleship. But hey, I appreciate you guys sharing that, because it's not always good to just be in our own silos. Jordan and I are both West Coast guys, so this is helpful for us to get a little bit different picture of the country. I think we're going to talk a little bit about retirement, and I'm curious to see what we're going to share and what your guys' experience has been.
Yeah, with that, based upon the conversation we just have and some of the things we kind of highlighted and saw in those sections you read, how do you think these realities of what's going on in the Church of Christ demographics and the 30-plus year decline, how is that affecting pastors and churches in relation to saving for retirement in your own experience? Dustin or Glenn, take it.
I mean, I can go first.
Yeah.
So my experience is a little unique. Well, I mean, I don't know. To me, it's unique. So when I went to Bible school, I kind of relate myself to a little bit to the rich young ruler, in a sense of I went the opposite way. The rich young ruler, I gave everything away. Okay. Like I sold everything. I cashed in my 401k and went to school. Okay. You know, we lived in it was like 4 or 5 bedroom house, got rid of it. We, you know, put what little we kept in like the medium sized U-Haul, and we went, you know, moved into a 2-bedroom apartment, me, my wife, and my 3 kids. We, with what I cashed in from my 401k, we had enough to pay for our move and a couple months rent and food, and we had enough support for it was to pay for our rent, and that was it. We didn't have commitment from supporters to support us for anything else, so we went on faith. Wow. God didn't let us down. We managed to pick up enough supporters to keep us going to school. And then after I graduated school, I went to Nebraska, and it was literally a stateside missionary. They were able to afford to pay me $1,500 a month. And I didn't have, none of my supporters committed to keep supporting me. And so I got a couple supporters, but I mean, there were times where we didn't have enough money for food. Yeah. God, it's crazy. God still, you know, there were times where we'd get checks in the mail randomly. God always took care of us. And so we were never able to save, you know. It wasn't until we moved to Wyoming that I was actually the first time I actually was able to be fully supported in ministry. Wow. But at the same time, my wife, at the end of our time in Nebraska, my wife decided to go back to school to get her master's and to become a therapist. Yeah. And so she's into the master's program right now. So we still haven't really been able to save fully. And so she has a 401k, a little bit in it. But you know, the church here doesn't help us with retirement. Okay. You know, they pay us well, you know, nothing amazing. Right. But, you know, with my experience, you know, the churches struggle in that area, you know, especially the small, in Nebraska, you know, because we don't have elders, you know, we didn't have elders there. Okay. We don't have elders where I'm at. They wouldn't even know where to start. And so it's just kind of it's just kind of thrown on me. You know, here's just what we pay you. And if you want to save for your retirement, you figure it out. Yeah. And so it's all up to me.
Got it. Yeah. That's one of the things. Go ahead.
I want to say that, you know, I don't even think they even think about the preacher's financial future.
Okay. Yeah. No, that makes sense. That experience makes sense. It's kind of in my research and then probably many people's experience, the denomination almost feels in many ways DIY, especially for the preacher's experience of figuring things out on their own, especially for saving and financial matters. Glenn, yeah, let's piggyback off of Dustin's thoughts and his story. And so what has your experience been like in light of these findings and demographics?
Well, something that popped in my head from what Dustin was saying is one time a church was like, what do you want us to pay you? And I was like, I just want you to practice the golden rule and treat me the way you want to be treated. And you tell this one brother was like, ouch, because, they don't think about retirement. A lot of these smaller churches, it is like here's your salary, do whatever you want with it.
Yeah.
In Los Banos, something they did that helped me was I was going to Grand Canyon, to work on my degree. And I said, just give the money straight to Grand Canyon to pay for my tuition, because that way, it's not income, And so I did the same thing when I moved to New Mexico. I was like, I want, X amount to be put in retirement just to defer me having to pay taxes on, which I know isn't supposedly the best way, but it was helping me to be at a certain income level for what I was trying to do. And so, they gladly did it. But, if I hadn't volunteered it, it wouldn't have happened, So I think the bigger the church, the more likely they would do to even consider offering retirement or matching or anything. But yeah, I've never heard a small church be like, hey, we really are concerned about your retirement, want you to save toward it, because, in the secular world, it's almost like a given, you can contribute to it, but it's, we just pay the preacher and that's what we do. I don't even think most churches even think about that they're not doing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So James Knapp's 2 studies found that both in studying had 200 participants of pastors in Texas, and nationally he did a second study on a similar number. He found that most Church of Christ pastors are over-reliant upon Social Security and, let's say, an IRA. And I'm just kind of interested to kind of get your input in terms of, do you feel like do you feel like over-reliant on just a couple traditional vehicles, or are you planning on drawing from different sources of retirement income using different vehicles as well?
So I've been told it's a bad strategy, but the vehicle I'm counting on is the inheritance. but yeah, I mean, honestly, even though my dad, is solid investing, has done all this stuff, he didn't educate me really in any of it until I asked just recently. And so, that kind of hamstrung me, because honestly, Social Security, IRA, I mean, what else is there? You know what I mean? Okay. I really didn't know the options until a couple years ago. And so, once again, it's one of those things, if a church or anyone were just to hold your hand and say, hey, look, these are the different things you can do. These are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these options. It would be different, because I didn't feel hamstrung by just a couple options if that's all you're really aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. Dustin, any thoughts on that? Do you anticipate drawing from any retirement sources other than traditional accounts at this time?
We will. Right now, we're not. We will. My wife was a personal banker for many years.
Okay.
And so I know she has quite a few ideas when she graduates and our income level our income changes.
That's good.
I know we've kind of discussed it, and I'm kind of leaving that more in her area.
Okay.
Because that's not my strong point.
Yeah.
And so she's, because she did that, she has all these, she kind of knows where she wants to go with that. But we have discussed that although we do want to have a 401k and, there are benefits to it, we don't want that to be the only area that we depend on.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, great.
I think this brings up an interesting piece with churches is the reliance on the spouse's income often. So for instance, my church in Glendale often relied on my wife supporting me with health insurance through the school district. So it didn't make sense for the church to provide it. I've got the joy of the Lord here in this coffee shop in the background. But so, I think that's an interesting thing to take into consideration, just how as our ministry has shifted to where there will be more women in ministry, and a lot of single people in ministry as demographics of our ministers change. Churches have to take into consideration, like, you can't always rely on dual income households or health benefits or retirement benefits coming through the spouse. So the big thing that, we have our spouse's income and our retirement and all that. But I do think that that's been a cheat sheet of kind of a cheat that churches have relied on in the past. It's something to take into consideration.
Yeah, no, it's a good thought too. In terms of moving on to the third question, you guys, if you read the introduction, what I wrote, Teresa Ghilarducci says that the new class divide for Americans is one's level of retirement anxiety. So how would you rate your retirement anxiety as a COC pastor in light of this DIY retirement crisis that she writes about?
Well, Dustin resonates with me. I mean, as a Christian, I'm like at a 0. Like, God's going to provide.
Okay.
Not really worried about it. Whether or not that's the smartest strategy, hey, there's times where I've been blessed. My wife was the sugar mama. We were able to put a lot toward, paying off our student loans and, doing this and that. And there's times that hasn't. It's not been one of those super great financial times, but I know God's going to provide, like Dustin said, and so, I have no anxiety, but that doesn't mean I have a great plan either,
Okay. All right. Dustin, how would you answer that? And from 1 to 10, what would be your level of retirement anxiety right now?
I would say a 0 as well. There was a time in my life where I would probably say like an 8 or a 9, but because of what I've gone through, because there have been times where, like I said, literally we were like, man, what are we going to do for food?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's crazy. Like we've gotten checks in the mail where it's like, oh, you've been part of this class action suit, or friends have sent us money, or just out of the blue. And it's like, what do you mean? How am I a part of I've checked into this. Like, how am I a part of this class action suit? It's $500 or I mean, just random. Like, and I'm like, this has to be God. Like, there's, and it's never at a time where I'm like, I have an abundance of money. It's always when like I'm at like my time of need, and God always provides. And that's why I'm like, and I know it's scriptural. We should prepare, and I have my plan, and I'm working towards it. But I also have that faith that I know God will always take care of me, and so that I just give that anxiety. I give that to Him, and I know that no matter where I go, what path I go down, it's ultimately in His hands. So but that doesn't negate the fact that I still am working towards a retirement.
Yeah. No, I appreciate both of you are all in this in terms of, hey, I'm not in it for the money. That was my approach as well. So that's why I think one of the hopes of this podcast and this study is to kind of be an impetus to churches to take care of their ministers, because their ministers are all in and have that mentality, and we need ministers like that. So, Lars, do you have any follow-up on their thoughts? All right, looks like Lars might be frozen for a second there, but let's go on to the fourth question on this list. You've already kind of done this some, so I don't know if there's any more that you might want to add in terms of telling your story from the angle of retirement savings and being a pastor within COCs. Is there anything else that you possibly could add to that you haven't already said?
I think just a point of emphasis, the churches, when I have asked about doing things, outside the box, like toward retirement or something else, like they've been very compliant. It's just you have to take the initiative to do something.
Okay. All right. Dustin, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, kind of like Glen said, I think if, the churches, for the most part, anything that is, when it comes to my income, I've never had any kind of pushback. And I think it's just because there's an ignorance that comes with it. I think there's just a lack of, other than here's how much we can afford, they just don't know. And so it's, they rely on me for that knowledge. But I think it would be nice if congregations had that knowledge, so they can, come to the table with, here's what we want to do for you.
Yeah.
And so there's, a reassurance for us.
Yeah, totally. So next question, Do you think being in Churches of Christ has hurt or helped your asset accumulation for retirement? Explain. All right, so Glenn, why don't you take it first?
Obviously there's denominations that have like very, whatever structured, and so sometimes I'm assuming, hoping, I guess, within that structure that they would account for it. But like I said, I think for me, it's more of a secular versus like ministry divide. Like most of my secular jobs that were like real jobs, they already had the options for retirement. So I think that, churches don't always think that way, especially with the autonomy, of the churches, just doing their own thing. I'm sure there's got to be someone somewhere that has a retirement plan, with their setup. But yeah, so I would say it's made it less likely, but I think that's at least as much based on my choice of ministry, as opposed to, that all the other churches have some amazing plan.
Okay. Dustin, how would you answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's really helped, but like Glenn said, that's, it's more of a choice. I didn't, go into it going, man, I'm going to accumulate myself a great worldly retirement. But I'm gathering myself treasures in heaven at the same time. So, I look at it from that type of retirement. But and like I've heard so my secular job before that I left to go to Bible school, there was I had a guy, an employee that worked that he was a member of a denomination, and we would talk back and forth, discuss his beliefs and my beliefs, and he shared that the things that they would give their head pastor, and he would say, like, once a year they would buy him a new house, or no, every so many years they buy him a new house. Once a year they buy him a new car, so either Mercedes or BMW or something like that. And they're like, well, we have to show the blessings. If not, then people wouldn't believe that God was blessing you, that you would have good things. So I was like, man, that's the church to be in, I guess.
Yeah, I see the up and down side too.
So
that's
so I guess there are churches like that you really get a retirement. But I think for the most part, people don't go into ministry because you're like really going to rack up a retirement.
No, not at all.
You're looking at the long game. You're looking at the treasures in heaven.
Right. And when we speak of retirement, again, we want to get away from the cliche negative viewpoint of how perhaps many Christians, perhaps even in Church of Christ, think of retirement. And that is, it's just, I don't want a 30-year vacation. I don't want a 30-year withdrawal where I'm just going to go play golf in the desert and enjoy life of luxury. We're not talking about that when we're talking about retirement. We're talking about thinking of how am I going to spend and live out the last third of my life in honor and glory to God. And so that's what one author calls the third age. So the last third of life, how can I live out my life like that? Finances are definitely a big aspect of how we're going to finish out our life and the legacy we're going to live. And so, when we do speak about retirement, let's stay away from, assume that we're not talking about that negative 30-year vacation and withdrawal. And we're talking about how to truly live out the last third of our life in honor and glory to God. Hey, Lars, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, we're thinking about assets and stuff. How did you get coaching in ministry? I mean, Dustin, your background getting into it, was there someone who came along and said, hey, this is how to think about Social Security and taxes, minister allowance? I mean, if you don't have an eldership thinking about some of those things, I guess I'd start with you, Dustin. Was there someone who came alongside you? It sounds like that pastor or that ministry leader who was talking about their church, that's a little bit of a different context than most of us have done ministry, where we're getting a new car every year. But yeah, where did you receive counsel, and what kind of counsel was it?
So when I went to school at Bear Valley, at preaching school, they actually had someone come in and talk to us, and they had an accountant that was attended the church there come in and actually talk to us about how to do our finances. And what to do. I was already fairly good. Math was my strong suit. Understanding that. My aunt was an accountant, or it was my mom's aunt, my great aunt. She was an accountant, and so I kind of had a little bit of help with that. Understanding it wasn't hard. My wife, was was in personal finance, so
Nice.
it kind of easily flowed, and so understanding it wasn't too bad. And so we've kind of just fell into place. I have a lot of preacher friends that they just went out and got accountants. They were just like, this is too much.
Yeah, no,
so they just
good.
Out of preaching school, they just went and got accountants and were like, tell me what to do.
Yeah, no, it's good. That's good.
For me, I was like, oh, this isn't. I sat down the first years and just really kind of figured it out. And now that my wife's getting into her secular work some, and I'm like, and things are starting to really go there, we're like, yeah, maybe it's time to get an accountant. Maybe it's time to really, because it's starting to get more complicated as her work starts to mix in. But we had someone come in and really just sit down and teach us, and have a talk with, this is what's all involved. If it's over your head, you get an accountant.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot with it, but he kind of broke it down for us.
No, that's great. I don't even remember having a conversation, somebody coming in to have a conversation with where I was going for my undergraduate studies at Freed-Hardeman. I took a class, but I don't hardly remember anything. And it wasn't geared toward pastors or ministers or preachers. And so that's pretty awesome that they did that for you there at Bear Valley. Thoughts, Glenn, on Lars's question?
Dr. Gamberg was the only one that ever said anything that I remember in grad school, and he said, don't place yourself out of Social Security, because you can say, oh, I'm not going to do it if I'm a missionary, have a moral objection, and so that was it. When I was at Como, like my first year doing taxes, I was like, just from VA and my other work experience, they always took out money for taxes, and I'm like, wait, no one took out money for taxes? So I didn't know I had to pay into Social Security. I didn't know nothing, and so I just kind of had to learn, like, oh, I don't want to cheat the government, I guess, and so and over time I learned more of the rules and what you could write off, and that was really eye-opening to me, that I could write off the mileage and stuff like that, because I wasn't doing that before, so it was kind of a few-year learning curve. And I did use H&R Block once, and they indirectly taught me some things, and so anyway, I learned through trial and error, I guess.
No, yeah,
by the grace of God.
Okay, next question, guys. What do you feel are the challenges to save for retirement as a pastor within Church of Christ, and what also what benefits are there, if any, as a pastor within Church of Christ to save for retirement?
Well, in searching for a job recently, I found there's an incredible disparity between what churches pay. Like, I applied to one that says they're offering $110 to $130 a year. And I applied to others. There's like a tenth of that. It felt like, and so it's really, you have much more flexibility to put generously into retirement if you feel like you're getting paid appropriately. And so if you're not getting paid a reasonable amount beyond what you're living on at the moment, then of course it's going to be much harder.
Right. Okay. So Glenn just mentioned some challenges. Dustin, what would you consider to be challenges?
Yeah, I would say that's a big one to pay, and then accountability. Because you a lot of times it's up to you, and life happens, and so it's tough when things come along and you're like, oh, you got to take care of things, and it's easy to be like, well, I'm gonna need this, and so you have to stay strong and be like, nope. I got to be accountable to my savings. I got to be accountable to these things.
Okay. Yeah. So we mentioned some challenges. What are some benefits, if any, that you've realized
for being within Church of Christ?
Yeah. For being within a pastor within Church of Christ in terms of saving for retirement.
They pay us.
That they do.
I'm done. Dustin, your turn.
I really haven't saved a whole lot for retirement, so I don't really know benefits now. So,
it's only going to go up from here, Jordan.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's awesome. Lars, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, benefits are always hard to take into consideration because I had a contribution plan, a match in my first church, but I was much better taken care of financially and spiritually and holistically, and my passions were, I was able to do what I really passionate about in my next church. I think the education benefit that you were talking about, Glenn, like that's a helpful thing to think about that a lot of churches could take advantage of that they don't, is continuing ed or seminary if you haven't gotten seminary. That the church indirectly benefits from that, and then often directly benefits from it. And I think that's a form of investing in your learning. And so, I think there's a lot of ways to think about retirement benefits and things. I would love for us to produce something, right, that these churches don't have to recreate and reinvent the wheel. And there are examples of these out there, but specifically for churches of Christ, I think it could be really, really helpful because so many of them are kind-hearted people. And I loved, Glenn, you talking about that. Like, I'd love for you to do to me, do unto me what you'd like to be done to yourself. And I think that's just a whole different imagination about compensation and benefits. And it wouldn't necessarily be a thing that we just kind of say everybody gets the same, because each family is in a different situation with Medicare and all the different things after Obamacare came in. Like, a lot of ministers probably qualify because they're low pay for free health insurance. So for the church to go out and purchase a health plan may be a bad use of funds, actually, and it may actually not help the minister out. So it's not just as simple as saying you need to provide health insurance and retirement. You need to take into consideration the situation that you're in. And but yeah, I think one of the ways I'd love to see churches move, and this is what I encourage my church to do, is to say, you don't need to give me a salary increase. You need to start contributing. I'm not asking for a raise after working for you for 3 years. I'm asking that you start to contribute to my retirement. And so I think sometimes as we look at that, there may be ways for us to kind of delay raises and increase benefits. And that would be better use of funds, in my mind, just because it doesn't put the onus on you as the individual to do the saving. It doesn't add another mental burden to you to say, am I putting this stipend to the right use?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the next question for you guys is, what have you found to be the greatest help in terms of saving for retirement as a pastor within Churches of Christ? Glenn, why don't you start?
I mean, I guess I could go the wisdom of God route, but I mean, the points in that we were making more money, it was so much easier, because my wife is a physical therapist, like when we were both working before having kids, like it wasn't that hard to do, and we were just maxing, putting in, for a while. And then even being in the church in New Mexico, like they paid a lot better than other churches I had been at. And so it was just very easy, because we were still more than making ends meet every month, and so yeah, honestly, the simplest thing is just having the extra income to be able to put in, is really when we contribute a lot.
Okay. Dustin, how would you answer that?
I think similar. We haven't been in a situation where we've had a lot of extra cash flow.
Yeah.
And so, just I think when we've had the extra money, we've put it away.
No, that's good. All right. Yeah, Lars, any thoughts in terms of that question?
No, I think again, our over reliance, right, on dual income is not just pastors' problem, right? This is in America. This is part of the DIY retirement crisis that is all around us, that we're a microcosm of. But where I live in Eugene is housing market's kind of crazy right now, and we started in where my wife was working part-time or full-time, and I was working part-time, and now we've flip-flopped. And we're barely able to make it because we have, we patch together. And we're no longer working at specifically, in churches, at a school, but the dilemma is the same. And so I think, as you kind of talk to your churches, you can paint this picture pretty easily because there's other couples in the same boat. There's people living now in multi-generational homes now, just to make it work. And I think that's important, just to kind of, this is not just a minister only problem, and we can't. No. I appreciate the sentiment of like God's going to care for us. I do, but I press into that and say like, okay, but should you have to, and should we have to rely on God just because the church isn't willing to step in and actually care for the people that are working for them? And so, if the situation arises, crisis happens, medical debt, and we trust in God, not in our finances, for sure. But I think too many churches are blindly and kind of unattentively going that route. They're not doing that out of faith in God. They're just doing that out of ignorance. And so, I don't think that it's on the ministers necessarily to tell that story. But I do think that within church leadership and with elderships, we better be a little more direct about how finances play in. And I think then our trust in God can come in the corporate body. Are we going to trust in God that God's going to provide the resources to care for Glen and Dustin's families in the way that we know they should be cared for? Then it's actually not just the individual minister's reliance on God. It's the church's reliance on God. Where are they putting their trust?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one interesting thing from, I believe it was the National Evangelical Association study on finances with thousands and thousands, I think, of pastors, lead pastors across the country, was that like majority said like, yeah, we're good. We got our personal finances. They're straight. They're in order. We're okay. But then all of them only had very, very little in terms of save for retirement. So there's somewhat of that inconsistency. It's like, again, there's that faith that God will take care of me, but there's also the reality of once they get to that last sort of life, are they going to be in that American DIY retirement crisis state, in which COC pastors are definitely a microcosm from apparently Knapp's 2 studies. And again, like Lars was saying, like it's not just pastors in COCs, it's not just pastors in general in America. It's a lot, and the majority of Americans are in this state. And it's going to create not only an economic, but also a moral crisis on our hands when millions of people are get to that point. And so we need to do as much as we can to try to prevent a lot of people from getting into that crisis state once they get to retirement, especially our pastors, according to, let's say, the Nazareth Manifesto Jubilee theology that we see in Scripture, and that how Jesus frames his ministry. Pastors themselves should be an example of that flourishing that we see in Jubilee within the very community that they serve. So I don't know if I have any thoughts to that.
I like the idea of thinking of us as like Levites and stuff, and they come in and bring in like the crops and whatnot to our doors. It's good, brother.
Okay. All right. In terms of question 8, what do you feel is the theological and ethical ideal in terms of saving for a living in retirement? I might just let the cat out of the bag and gave you the answer, but did you have your own way of thinking about this before reading the paper?
Yeah, so for me, in terms of the do it side, it's really like primarily in my mind, Ecclesiastes 11, where it talks about cast your bread upon the water, put your savings in 7 or 8, things, because it might not come back to you, or I got to read it, brother. But anyway, if you go with that passage, because you could take the other side, you could go like, Jesus said, don't lay up your treasure on earth and all this stuff, but like, I'm not just willing to throw Solomon and the Old Testament out the window either. You know what I'm saying? And so let me go there real quick. I had that. Dustin, go ahead and talk, and then I'll
all right,
maybe read my verses.
Yeah, like I've mentioned before, like, we trust God. We lay our treasures up in heaven, but at the same time, Jesus talks about, the 3 guys, who prepared, and so there's a biblical idea of preparing. And so we're to prepare for the future. Where you don't build a barn. You don't go to war without counting the cost, without preparing. As long as God's at the forefront and is involved in it, we're not. I think it's like you said, we're not preparing so we can go on this 30-year vacation.
Yeah.
We're not storing this money up so we can be like, I can live out my life without God. Mm-hmm. But it's to live that third of your life out, in glory to God. I had a preacher. He was the one who baptized me. Someone I know very dearly. He lived his life out on Social Security, and I think he had some others as well. But the way he spent his life out was he used the money he had for retirement to go work with other churches that couldn't afford him for as long as he could, and then he, as long as he could work with someone else.
That's great.
And it's like, and I look at like that's what I want to do. Mm-hmm. But it's like I think it's a biblical thing that we use, that we save, that we include God in our savings, and I think it's biblical that the church helps us with that. I really like the idea that we, maybe create something that, maybe we can, that can be given to the churches, because there is, I think, just this large area of ignorance with a lot of churches that they don't offer because they just don't know. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a way that if there's something available for them that they can take and understand, that they can be like, oh, here, this is what we can offer you, that it's a way that they can bring glory to God. Instead of being like, well, we're just going to have faith that God will take care of you. It's a way that we'll know this is where we're going to take our money that God's blessed us with, and we're going to invest it in your future, so that you can bring glory to God.
Okay, great. Lars, any thoughts on that?
No, I think, I appreciate the focus, and I think I think sometimes in these conversations we can get the cart before the horse and really be thinking a little bit too much about the vehicles of retirement being our safety net, and it's helpful to have examples, people who have lived with less and who have honored God in that time, and I think I've said often, without the doomsdayers, we don't change, but that means that the doomsdayers stuff never comes true, right? So people have been saying Social Security was going to be bankrupt for years, every few years, and it's not. And so we want to listen to people who are calling attention to the crisis, but we also want to, it comes down to the individual to make a few choices, and then trust that God's going to bring the increase and hold us. And I think that's the mentors that I've had in my life who've had, whether a spouse leave them or a die or a child die, have talked a lot about that moment where they feel God just holding them. And I think what we don't want to do is force that crisis upon ministers in the third age of their life. We don't want to be the reason by which they have to experience a crisis, and so we can be intentional now. But we can also recognize that God is gonna hold us. We are God's beloved, whether we were saved for retirement or not. And I think that's another thing, is some of us ministers are better with finances, savvy with finances, or don't have as much anxiety about these things. And others can then kind of hear our stories and walk away going, well, I must be not called to ministry. And that's not true. If you're experiencing anxiety about your retirement, or if you're, maybe not as savvy when it comes to finances, like I hope you've heard, you can get help, you can hire an accountant, or you can phone a friend, or something. But more than that, you're not any less called to God's mission, and you're not any less loved by God, just because maybe you haven't been as good at saving as others around you.
Yes. Thank you for that word, Lars. So
I completely agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with that, because like looking at my history, like I have less anxiety from it because I came from a point in my life where I was completely dependent on myself and I was completely wrapped up in material things. And I think it took me walking away from all that and being completely reliant on God to get rid of that, from my life. And so I see, the path that I've kind of walked where it's like, I don't have that anxiety, but that's my path. That's where I've come from, and I think it's, God working in my life that's caused that for me, where I can look back and be like, yeah, I don't have that anxiety because, I've gone through these trials and that's formed me, and matured me to this person where, I've have these battle scars and, but that's not everyone, and some people, there was a time in my life where, yeah, it did stress me out. But that didn't mean any, I wasn't any less called to ministry. I just haven't gone through the things that I needed to go through yet to get me to where I am today. And so I think that's a very good point.
Totally. Glen, any follow up on that?
Oh, I was just going to do my 2 verses. This is Ecclesiastes 11:2. I already did one with the cast your bread upon the waters, for you'll find after many days, like the idea of investment. Verse 2, it says, give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you do not know what disaster may happen on earth. So, we don't put it all like on black at the casino. We don't put it all in one stock or whatever, like diversify. In verse 6, it says, in the morning sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, this or that, or whether both alike will be good. And I mean, I would argue that could apply to a lot of things, like even ministry and like what you're trying to do to reach out to people or help people. But even like, Paul had a tent making job, and sometimes he was just making the tents, and sometimes churches were fully supporting him and partially supporting him, and God worked it all together, and you don't have to have just this little box or bubble, that to make it all work the same way your whole life. But if you have that, I guess, praise God,
Yeah, and we want churches to show hopefully some more imagination other than an either or, like we fully support the pastor or he's Bivo. Like we need to come up with some imaginative, creative, innovative ways of supporting the mission and the pastor that perhaps haven't existed before. And that's something that multiple writers are exploring right now. I forget which books that I've cited in the paper are talking about that. But we need churches to be more innovative and imaginative in that regard, especially with the diminishing numbers and diminishing in terms of reliance upon traditional sources of income in retirements. This is Social Security and 401ks and IRAs and such. But yeah, like kind of just piggybacking off of some of you said, like the rival god in Scripture to loyalty to Yahweh is mammon, it's money. So it's like this is very tricky subject here when we talk about saving for retirement and like what is the right balance and what's the line that you don't cross and what is too much. It's very difficult for people to write theologies of money and possession because there's so many things you got to account for in order to write a well-balanced theology of money and possessions. And what's interesting is, like I've mentioned this in other podcast episodes, it's like nobody really dives deep into retirement. They might gloss over it on a surface level, but they all kind of seem to kind of stay away from it. And retirement is a beast to try to deep dive theology in and of itself. So you could probably write books and books on that subject alone when you look at it theologically. But in terms of wrapping up these final 2 questions, guys, what do you feel that you've done well, and what do you feel like you need to do differently? Churches too. So, Glen, why don't you start?
In terms of retirement, or
in terms of retirement, yeah.
Question? Okay.
Let's hone the existentialism down into retirement.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, I need to repent, brother. Okay. I think I've tried to listen to more than one person about retirement. like I've made mistakes in my life because I discovered these verses in Proverbs about, like getting wise counsel and all that. And I'll just take one person's whatever and run with it. So I've had to, do the other verses, really hear what they're saying. The multiple counselors' plans are established, and something like, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, all your chips in, like to really think about it, pray about it, and in the seasons where it's easier to contribute, okay. And seasons it's not, that's okay too, and just to really, just learn from your mistakes and.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Dustin, how would you answer that question? No, that's good. That's great. How would you answer that question for yourself and perhaps for churches?
Personally, I think just handling my money well, both myself and my wife. We when we first got married, we were young and we were dumb and we didn't handle our money the best. And then we wised up, and we didn't go through any like program or anything. We just sat down and thought about it and got smart, and just started handling our money really well. We've looked at different programs that, and then we're, and the different programs we looked at, we're like, oh, we're already doing this, we're already doing that. And so we've just been very wise with what God has blessed us with. And so we don't have crazy amount of debt. We don't, we have good credit scores. We have, we've just been very, very wise with what we have. I think we do need to do better with actually having, putting something away. And I think, something that churches need to, I think, do better with as well, helping ministers in that area.
Yeah. Lars, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've covered this in a couple previous episodes, but minister housing allowance and how you handle that is a big one. Whether you're investing in property, I mean, I think especially in rural settings, that maybe is easier than in urban settings, where renting is more of the thing. But I think one of the unique parts of this article I just read, it's a guy, Mike Glen, who's retiring from a large church, but he wrote this kind of like for the pastor who follows me, and he talks about co-vocational staff and volunteers, and I thought this was an interesting thing. It's going to be a patchwork of full-time programs and ministries with employees that have limited hours, and more of the pastor's time will be spent training, assigning, overseeing volunteer and part-time ministers, and everyone in attendance may be involved in the worship and have some kind of job in the church's ministry. What used to be maybe in these larger churches, he's kind of forecasting, might have been 40-hour work weeks per job, will be broken up into 10 4-hour per week people or 8 5-hour per week positions. And I think that imagination Jordan was talking about earlier is the thing that I would want to see more, because I was pursuing that. The church that I was at in Glendale before I stepped away from full-time ministry there was giving me space to explore kind of a co-vocational thing. It wasn't a strict, I was going to leave the church. It was pursuing these programs in a new way.
No, it's good. It reminds me of that one Chick-fil-A manager who's, giving people all their hours, but within a 3-day work week. So it's like, that's a very different way of going about doing that. I don't know if you guys heard about that in the news recently, but it made its way around to all the local TV stations around here, at least. Last question, guys. What would you tell a new pastor or pastor in training about saving for retirement while in ministry before they are really in the thick of it?
So when I was at VA, like I was like just turned 24, and they're like, oh, here's the option to get retirement or not. And I'm like, I'm cool, I'm 24. And she was like, whoa, hold on. She's like, if you start saving now, you only have to save like a little bit, for this 40 plus years, and you'll be much better off than someone that waits. And so I think to bring the topic up early and educate people, I think would make a huge difference.
Okay. Dustin, what do you think, man?
Yeah, I would definitely encourage them to sit down and figure out which mode of retirement, which vehicle they want to use, and discuss it with the congregation that they're, that they're going to minister to. That don't just try to do it on their own, but try to work it in their deal. Discuss it and make it a plan. One of my employees that I had before I started working, especially if it's a young minister, one of the employees I had when I started, when I was working at the secular job before I started ministering, I think he was like 18 or 19, and he already had his retirement planned out. And he would, like, weekly we would talk about it, and he was like, I'm retiring at, I think he had it in like either late 40s or early 50s. And like weekly we talk about, and he would tell me all the different retirement tools he had. And he's like, if I put away this much right now, and we were constantly going out about it. And he's like, oh, this much to retire on, and his retirement was the whole vacation,
okay,
beach on the sunset. But like, he was strict, and he was like dead set on it, but he had a plan. And it's like, and if you come up with a plan, and you discuss it with the congregation, at least make them aware, and get them bought in on your plan, you'll be, I guess, have more success at it, rather than just going at it alone.
Totally. A plan is definitely going to make you more successful than not having a plan. Not having a plan is a recipe for disaster. Lars, what would you have to say if, or add anything that you haven't already said in light of that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough with new pastors because everybody's coming in different, whether you're 24 or you're newly married, or, I was newly married. And so it was like we were planning our honeymoon, and it seemed like a good idea to blow the wad on that and stuff. So, but I think, debt, debt is like the opposite of retirement. And so, if you could tell them debt is bad and and retirement is good, and try and get that in the language that they understand. I think one guest we've had on already, Dusty Breeding, in one of his blogs, he talked about don't spend your money. He was talking to youth ministers. Don't spend your money on youth group kids. And I think, if I was to tell anything, it would be to a young pastor, preacher, a youth minister, like, make sure that you advocate for yourself. Don't buy your own books. Don't go to that conference on your own dime. And definitely get a budget for taking people out to coffee and connecting with them. Because that can quickly get you into a bind where you're spending a lot of your own money that could be going to retirement. And that might be just a conversation to say to a church. And if they don't go for the retirement piece, they might go for a little bit more of a budget when it comes to books or conferences or coffees, and take that money that you would have spent on those things and put it into retirement. But I know some of my own tendencies was that way at the beginning. Hey, I want to take this kid out to dinner. I'm working with him. I'm having people over to my house for a Bible study. I'm going to make dinner, go to Costco. And that can quickly get out of hand real quick.
All right. Any parting thoughts, you guys? Any wisdom, any advice for pastors within this crazy American DIY retirement crisis, in the words of Teresa Gilarducci? Anything you want to add to finish it off?
There's this guy, Jordan Koss, that knows a lot about it, and you should take some words of wisdom from him.
I don't know about that one. I don't know if that's wisdom. I think that might be the other path, the broad path. But no, anything else? Anything to add? All right.
I would just say, don't put it to the wayside, because it's going to get you nowhere.
Okay. Yeah, totally. I avoided the topic for way too long, and have student debt, among other things, to have to deal with. But I got some time to have to deal with. But yeah, thank you guys for your wisdom, your advice, just sharing your stories, talking about finances in general, but definitely about retirement is vulnerable. And I was hoping for some vulnerability in these conversations and in these interviews doing these episodes. And I appreciate the candor and the vulnerability that you have provided us and for the viewers and listeners today. That's all for what we have in this episode. Guys, we'll be back next time. We have a few more special guests and a few more pastor interviews to do as well from different regions of the country. But until then, we will see you next time. Bye-bye. Once again, thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Almost Essential podcast. If you like what you heard and you want to reach out, you can connect with me, Jordan Koss, on Facebook or Instagram. We hope this series is a valuable resource for you, pastor or otherwise. And remember, you are not almost essential. Your role and service in the church is essential, as well as saving for retirement within your holy vocation and calling.